Today, we're going to unravel the story of a single fiber, a fiber that built an empire, shaped an entire nation's economy, and, touched millions of lives. We are talking, of course, about jute, India's golden fiber. All right, here's what we're diving into. We'll start at the very beginning with jute's ancient roots. Then we'll look at the revolution that turned it into an imperial powerhouse. We'll also get into the pretty immense human cost of all that growth, the shocks that almost killed the industry, and the complicated legacy it leaves behind.
Okay, so our story starts way back. We're talking centuries before the first factory even existed, in the villages of Bengal. You see, long before jute was this massive global commodity, it was just a fundamental part of daily life. It was literally woven into the fabric of society.
And hey, this isn't some recent thing. I mean, we've got records from the 16th century, from the court of the Mughal Emperor Akbar no less, that talk about how important jute was. A famous text, the Ain-i-Akbari, which was like a detailed account of his administration, it flat out says that for everyday people, this tough, versatile fiber was absolutely essential. We're talking clothing, ropes, twine, all of it processed on simple hand looms and spinning wheels. It just goes to show you, this was part of a really long and rich local tradition.
So that's the big question, right? How does a humble village craft explode into a global commodity? Well, the incredible transformation from a local plant to an imperial powerhouse, it doesn't start with a machine. Nope, it starts with the land itself.
Turns out, the Ganga-Brahmaputra Delta was basically the perfect nursery for growing jute. I mean, it had everything. The exact right kind of sandy soil, just the right amount of rain, and that hot, humid climate the plant absolutely loves. And the key thing, the real game changer, was all the river water. You need tons of water for a process called retting. It's basically soaking the jute stalks to separate out the fibers. It's essential for getting good quality jute. And because the conditions here were so ridiculously perfect, this one single region ended up producing a whopping 90% of all the jute in India. Just incredible.
All right, let's fast forward a bit. We're jumping to the 19th century, because this is when European technology and, a whole lot of money show up and spark an industrial explosion. This is the moment where that local craft smashes right into global ambition. And believe me, everything's about to change.
So for the longest time, jute had this one big problem. Its industrial potential was totally locked up because the fibers were just too coarse and tough for the machines of the day. They just couldn't handle it. The breakthrough, funnily enough, didn't even happen in India. It happened all the way over in Dundee, Scotland. Around the 1830s, some clever spinners there figured out that if you treated the jute with a mix of whale oil and water, it softened the fiber just enough to be spun by a machine. It sounds like such a small thing, right? But that one discovery, that was the key that blew the doors wide open.
Okay, so once that tech was sorted, British entrepreneurs basically saw dollar signs. The logic was simple. Why go through the hassle of shipping raw jute all the way to Scotland when you could just build the mills right next to the fields? Makes sense, right? So in 1855, a guy named George Ackland, a British entrepreneur, he partnered up with a Bengali financier, Babu Baisambir Sen, and they set up the very first jute mill near Calcutta. Just 2 years later, boom, the first steam-powered mill is up and running. And after that, well, the growth was just insane. By 1869, you've got 5 mills. Fast forward to 1910, and that number has exploded to 38 companies running over 30,000 looms. It was a proper gold rush.
It is really hard to wrap your head around just how massive this expansion was. I mean, just look at these numbers. You go from less than 1,000 looms in 1869 to over 30,000 by 1910. And it doesn't stop there. It more than doubles again to almost 70,000 by 1939. That's a 70-fold increase in 70 years. It's nuts. The mills in India, all clustered along the Hooghly River, they didn't just catch up to the ones back in Scotland, they blew right past them in both size and quality.
So all this massive industrial power, it wasn't just for bragging rights. Oh no, it had a very clear purpose. It was about to turn Indian jute into something the global economy absolutely could not live without. And for the British Empire, it became one of its most powerful engines.
And the speed of this change was just staggering. In just over 40 years, jute's economic importance went through the roof. Get this, in 1878, it was already a big deal, India's 5th largest export. But by 1921, it had completely taken over. It became the single most valuable thing being shipped out of India, period. Nothing else was even in the same league.
So let that sink in for a second. By the early 1920s, more than a quarter of the value of everything Every single thing shipped out of British India came from jute. For the colonial administration, this was a cash cow. It was a vital source of foreign currency and revenue that they used to pay for, well, pretty much everything. Their operations, their military, the whole shebang.
Jute was everywhere. It had become the world's workhorse, the go-to material for packaging and shipping anything and everything. You know those gunny sacks carrying grain from America or cotton from Egypt? Jute. The ropes holding cargo on ships crisscrossing the globe? Jute. The millions upon millions of sandbags that lined the trenches of World War I? You guessed it, Indian jute. The world was, and I mean this quite literally, being held together by this stuff. By 1947, mills in India were pumping out 70% of all the jute products used on the entire planet.
But, and this is a huge but, behind all these incredible numbers, all the profits and exports, there's a much, much darker side to the story. A human story. You see, this amazing productivity didn't just come from machines. No, it was built on the backs of hundreds of thousands of workers. And the price they paid for all that profit was incredibly steep.
So let's ask the question, who was actually paying the price? Who were the people fueling this incredible engine of empire? Who were the human beings inside these giant, noisy factories, turning raw plant fiber into the world's packaging?
We're talking about a massive workforce. By 1940, 300,000 people were working in the jute industry. Now, to put that number into perspective, since most of the mills were around Calcutta, that was almost 15% of the entire city's population. Think about that. An entire city's worth of people, all depending directly on these mills to survive. And life for them? It was brutal. I'm not just talking about hard work. This was raw exploitation. Imagine working 12, even 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, with hardly any breaks. The pay was kept so low, it was barely enough to keep you alive, trapping families in a vicious cycle of poverty. The machines were incredibly dangerous, totally unguarded, which meant accidents were common and often horrific, and you got little to no compensation. The factories were hot, filthy, and badly ventilated, so lung diseases were rampant. And worst of all, child labor was everywhere. Kids working in these same awful conditions for even less money. It's just heartbreaking. So just try to picture what a day was like for these workers. You start your shift sorting through these huge, dusty bales of raw jute. Then you have to feed these tough reeds into giant, heavy rollers that are dripping with that oil and water mix to soften them up. From there, it's onto the carding machines. These were seen as the heart of the mill, but they were also the most dangerous. They were basically giant machines with huge mechanical teeth that would rip and comb the fibers. Then those fibers get stretched and pulled and combined, then twisted into yarn. And finally, that yarn goes into these massive, deafeningly loud power looms to be woven into fabric. And you did every single one of those grueling, dangerous steps for 12 hours a day.
But here's the thing about being on top of the world. The industry's global dominance had a hidden weakness. Because its fate was so tied to international trade, it was incredibly vulnerable to things happening thousands of miles away. And well, the 20th century, it was about to throw one massive curveball after another.
The whole industry was on a wild roller coaster ride. World War I hits, and suddenly there's this massive boom. They can't make sandbags and other military stuff fast enough. But then, just a decade later, the Great Depression slams the world economy. Global trade just dries up, nobody needs packaging, and the industry is brought to its knees. Then World War II kicks off, and boom, another revival, thanks to huge demand from the Allied armies. It was just this dizzying, crazy cycle of boom and bust.
However, nothing, and I mean nothing, not war, not economic collapse, could have prepared the industry for what was coming in 1947, a political earthquake called the Partition of India. This one single event was about to become the most devastating blow the industry had ever faced.
And this right here, this is the absolute heart of the problem. When they drew that border between India and the new country of East Pakistan, they basically took a giant knife and sliced the jute industry clean in two. Think about it. Almost all of the mills, all that industrial machinery stayed in West Bengal, which was part of India. But about 80% of the best jute growing land, the actual fields that supplied the raw material for those mills, was suddenly in another country, East Pakistan.
Just try to imagine that. In the blink of an eye, a supply chain that had been built up over 100 years was just gone, severed. India was left with this giant, hungry industrial machine, an army of mills, with nothing to feed it. The economic chaos wasn't just bad, it was immediate and absolutely catastrophic.
Okay, so let's get to our final section, because what we're going to see is how this one single event
Partition, created this long shadow of challenges for the once unstoppable jute industry, and how it set it on a completely new and much, much tougher path after independence.
So the new independent India basically inherited an industry that was facing a perfect storm. First, you have the raw material shortage from Partition, which just became this constant nagging problem. Then, at the same time, new synthetic materials, plastics like polypropylene, start popping up all over the world, and they're a cheaper, tougher alternative to jute. Add to that the decades of bad blood from the terrible labor conditions, which led to constant strikes and disputes. And to top it all off, a lot of the mills were just getting old, and they were really struggling to update their technology to compete in this new world.
And all of this really leaves us with one final big thought. The story of jute, it's so much more than just the history of a plant or an industry, right? It's this incredibly powerful, really complex reminder of how all these different forces, global demand, colonial politics, new technology, and one single massive political decision can all crash together and completely change the fate of an entire economy, and in doing so, change the lives of millions of people for generations. So, if you want to dig into this even more, we've got you covered. Head on over to our website, the link is right there in the description, where you can find all our detailed notes and a really handy quick revision mind map for everything we talked about today.